Pretty obsessed with this case in Ohio, these 16 children. Hampton, Ohio, Vinton County. It happened on June 30th. Sheriff's deputy.
A room with no working light, no door that opens from the inside, 12 feet by 12 feet. 16 children lived inside that space, and one of them was already 18 years old and had never once been taught to write her own name. Two of those children were sick enough to require an emergency airlift to a trauma center. Nobody inside that house made the call. Somebody else found them like that. This isn't an old story. It isn't a closed case. Right now, as you're watching this, there is an active legal battle underway that could stop officials from ever telling the public anything else about it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how 16 children disappeared in plain sight, and why almost nobody noticed until it was almost too late. Before we go further, I want to be upfront with you. This case involves the prolonged neglect of real children, and some of what you're about to hear is genuinely disturbing. If that's not something you want in your feed today, this is your moment to step away, no judgment, still here. Then let's do this properly. Hit subscribe right now, before you get pulled into the story and forget, because this case is moving fast, new developments are landing weekly, and there's a real chance that the legal fight I mentioned a moment ago could cut off public information entirely. If that happens, you'll want to already be subscribed to catch whatever comes next. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I read every single one, and later in this video, I'm going to ask you a question I genuinely want your take on. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because nothing about this case makes sense until you understand exactly where it happened. Picture the smallest county in the entire state of Ohio. Just over 12,000 people, spread across a county with an operating budget of roughly $8 million a year, less than what some single schools spend annually in bigger cities. Now picture a dead-end road inside that county, woods pressing in on every side, a railroad yard sitting directly in front of a house that had exactly one neighbor, within sight. That's where this starts. A state lawmaker who represents the district actually drove out to see the property himself, because he said he wanted to understand what he was talking about before he spoke publicly about it. What he found, in his own words, didn't make any more sense standing in front of it than it did reading about it on the news. He talked to the only people nearby who might have seen something. A hardware store owner told him a man matching the father's description had come in exactly one time, more than a year before the arrests, to buy plumbing supplies. That's the entire footprint. One visit, one purchase, over a year apart from the next sighting anyone can recall. Employees at a nearby discount store said the family would come in late, after 9:30 at night, sometimes right at closing, always among the very last customers of the day. One employee, who didn't want to be identified, described the parents as looking disheveled, worn down, like people who hadn't had access to basic hygiene in a long time. Nobody in that town ever saw a child. Not one. A neighbor told reporters afterward that in all the time the family lived there, he never once saw a single kid outside, and there were 16 of them living inside that house. Here's what should stop you cold. This is not a place without resources. Within a few miles, there's a food processing plant employing over 1,000 people. 15 minutes up the road, there's industrial work. Not far from there, a major truck manufacturing plant where people from that exact county commute to work every day. This wasn't an area starved of opportunity. This was a family that, for reasons nobody outside those walls has been able to explain, chose to disappear from every single system built to notice people. Not the job market. Not the school system. Not the medical system. Not even the daylight hours of their own town. And when investigators finally went inside that house on June 30th, what they found didn't just lead to an arrest. It triggered something Ohio has almost never done in a case like this. State lawmakers approved over $1 million in dedicated emergency funding, not for a program, not for a policy initiative, but specifically for this. 16 children, one-line item. A former deputy attorney general who has worked in Ohio law for decades said he had never once seen the state carve out a standalone budget line for a single case before. Foster care providers testified that therapeutic-level care, the kind many of these children are almost certainly going to need, runs between $150 and $250 per day, per child. Multiply that across 16 children, for as long as it takes, and you start to understand why officials said the cost alone could have bankrupted the county if the state hadn't stepped in. The regional agency that had to absorb all 16 children into its foster care system saw its caseload jump by more than 50% overnight. One case, one household, and an entire regional child welfare system nearly doubled its workload in a single day. And it wasn't just money. Word got out, and offers of support started pouring in from outside the state, dozens of requests to donate directly to the children, some from as far away as Canada. So here's the question that should actually be keeping you watching. How does a household with 16 children generate this much attention, this much emergency funding, this much shock, and still leave behind almost no trace in the community around it for years? The answer starts with two people you might not expect. Not everyone connected to this family is describing the household investigators walked into. A relative who says she hadn't seen the grandparents in more than 6 years came forward publicly, and what she described sounds almost like a different family entirely. A clean home. The ordinary, unremarkable smell of something like lavender. Toys scattered on the floor but not filth. Not neglect. She said she grew up knowing these two people as respectful, careful, even lovable. And then she said something that reframes the entire case, at least from her point of view. She believes the grandparents' health quietly collapsed in the years since she last saw them, strokes, possibly dementia, a slow decline that nobody on the outside was close enough to track. She said that watching the court appearance footage, it looks to her like they don't fully understand what's happening around them. She went further. She said she believes in her heart that the true source of harm in that household wasn't the elderly couple everyone assumed was responsible. It was their adult son. A second relative, an uncle, offered an account that lines up with part of that theory. He said one of the grandparents suffered a stroke that affected both his cognitive ability and his physical mobility. He said he isn't even sure the older man fully understands what's happening in his own case anymore. And here's where it gets genuinely complicated, because this same relative also said something that flips the usual assumption about who was providing for these children. He said it was the grandparents, not the parents, who had originally been the ones holding the household together, financially and otherwise. And that once their health failed, once they were no longer physically capable of managing a home that size, that's when things appear to have collapsed. He said the extended family would have taken the children in themselves if they'd known, but they were already caring for children from another relative and didn't have the resources to take on more. So ask yourself, the question these two relatives are quietly asking too, was this 4 adults making one collective, ongoing decision to neglect 16 children? Or was it 2 people who had once genuinely held a household together, losing that ability slowly enough that nobody outside ever saw it happen, while 2 other adults either couldn't or wouldn't step in to fix it? Neither of these relatives is denying what was found in that house. Nobody is claiming the children weren't in serious danger. What they're describing is a slow unraveling, not a household that was always like this, but one that apparently became this gradually, invisibly, while the extended family drifted further and further away. One of them said something that stayed with a lot of people who have followed this case. She said she feels guilty. That maybe if she'd reached out sooner, if the distance between them hadn't grown so wide, she might have caught what was happening before it reached this point. Another family member, married into the family, said something that adds a very different layer entirely. He described the mother in this case as someone who came from an extremely difficult background herself, and who found something like refuge with this family as a teenager. He said the extended family has received death threats since the arrests, people telling them, in his words, that they should be lined up, that they should be harmed for what happened. He wanted people to understand that the wider family, the 4 other daughters raised by these same grandparents, all of whom went on to live stable, successful lives, were horrified by what they learned, the same as everyone else. So you have four completely different threads, all coming from people who actually knew this family. A niece describing a clean, loving household that quietly deteriorated. An uncle describing two elderly caretakers whose health collapsed out from under them. A brother-in-law describing a mother who may have been as much a product of that household as the children she raised inside it. And investigators describing a scene that none of those explanations fully accounts for. I want to know what you think. Genuinely, put it in the comments below. Do you believe this was deliberate cruelty from the start, or a family that quietly fell apart while everyone around them assumed things were fine? I'll be reading through these and responding to some of you in the follow-up video on this case, because whatever the answer is, it doesn't explain the next part of this story, the part where this family didn't just stay hidden by accident. They appear to have been extremely good at it. Before we go further, I want to pause for 1 second, because this is usually the point in a video like this where people drift off, so let me give you a reason not to. Everything I've told you so far is the sympathetic version of this case, the version family members are telling reporters right now. What's coming next is the part almost nobody is talking about yet, the paper trail. Birth records, school records, benefit records, a documented pattern that shows this wasn't a family that slipped through the cracks. This was, in several very specific ways, a family that appears to have engineered its own disappearance. If you want to see exactly how deep that goes, and I promise you, it goes deeper than you think, make sure you're subscribed, because I'm going to be doing a dedicated follow-up once new court documents are unsealed, and you do not want to miss that one. If you found this video useful so far, a quick like helps this reach more people who haven't heard about this case yet. It genuinely makes a difference for a channel this size. Okay, let's follow the paper trail. Here's the part of this case that should worry you far more than the house itself, because this isn't really about one family anymore. It's about how easy it apparently was. Records show this family moved constantly. Not once or twice, repeatedly, across multiple counties over the better part of 2 decades. Public birth records tell part of the story on their own. Nearly every child in this family was born in a different location, and almost every birth record lists a different home address. Different hospitals, different counties, sometimes barely overlapping with where the family had been listed just a year or two before. At one point, a birth certificate from this family lists an address in Wisconsin, despite the birth itself taking place at a hospital in Ohio. Just sit with that for a second. An address on the other side of the country, on a legal document, for a birth that happened hundreds of miles away. That is not how families move for a new job. That is how families move when they're staying one step ahead of something, and there's documented proof that at least one system did try to catch up with them and failed. When the family was living in one particular county, the local school district formally flagged several of the older children as chronically absent. That triggered a legal process. The children were labeled at risk of being classified as truant under state law. It should have led somewhere. It didn't. Because by the time the courts tried to actually serve the family with legal paperwork, they weren't there anymore. They had already moved. The case simply stalled, not because anyone gave up, but because there was, quite literally, no one left in that jurisdiction to serve. Now here's the detail that turns this from a tragic oversight into something closer to a systemic failure. There is no indication that flag ever followed them to wherever they went next. A truancy concern raised in one county apparently never reached the next county the family landed in. Nobody connected those dots because, as far as anyone can tell, there was no system in place designed to connect them. And it wasn't just one district. Multiple school districts spanning close to 2 decades have now confirmed the same thing. No enrollment records. No homeschooling registration. Nothing. 16 children, and not one documented day of formal schooling that any agency has been able to locate, for any of them, anywhere. In Ohio, the law requires school-age children to either attend school or be formally registered as homeschooled. That requirement exists specifically to create a checkpoint, a moment where the state is legally required to know a child exists. It's one of the very few built-in tripwires the system has. This family appears to have never triggered it. Not once in any county for any child over a span of roughly 18 years. But the truancy gap isn't even the most disturbing part. It's the benefits. When lawmakers started asking how a household of this size sustained itself, the answer that came back was almost harder to process than the neglect itself. This family was not receiving food assistance, not receiving any form of monthly child benefit. Nothing. The only confirmed income entering that household, a household of roughly 20 people, was 2 Social Security checks belonging to the grandparents. 2 checks. 20 people. Officials were careful to say they legally can't confirm or deny individual benefit applications because of privacy law. But what emerged from testimony was a portrait of a family that had essentially never entered the system in any capacity. No benefit applications on record. No enrollment. No documented medical visits. Nothing that would have put this family on a caseworker's radar ever for any reason. One state official, who said he's worked in this field for 40 years, put it about as plainly as anyone has. He said a single child going unnoticed by the system is bad enough, but 16 children from one family, invisible at the exact same time, wasn't something he'd ever encountered in his entire career. Here's what that actually means when you strip away the legal language. This family wasn't failed by a system that lost track of them. They were never inside the system to begin with, and a child protection system that is built to respond to complaints, applications, and enrollment has no built-in mechanism for finding families that never generate any of those things in the first place. That's not a bureaucratic detail. That's the entire vulnerability this case exposes. And once you see that vulnerability clearly, you start noticing it isn't unique to this one county or even this one state. Child welfare systems across the country are largely built the same way, reactive rather than proactive. A caseworker gets involved after a complaint is filed, after a school flags an absence, after a hospital sees an injury that doesn't match the explanation. Every single one of those triggers depends on someone somewhere generating a data point the system can actually see. Take away the school enrollment. Take away the benefit application. Take away the hospital visit, the neighbor's phone call, the landlord's complaint. What's left is exactly what investigators found here, a household that on paper simply didn't exist. Not hidden in the sense of actively evading law enforcement with fake names or forged documents. Hidden in the far simpler, far more chilling sense of just never showing up anywhere in the first place. That's the part of this case that should unsettle you long after the legal proceedings are over. It's not really a story about a system failing to catch a warning sign. It's a story about what happens in the gap where no warning sign was ever generated at all, and how many other households, right now, in counties nobody's covering on the news, might be sitting in that exact same gap. It's worth pausing on just how counterintuitive that is. Most people assume a family this large would be harder to hide, not easier. More children means more chances for someone to notice. A teacher, a pediatrician, a neighbor's kid wondering why the house next door never has anyone playing outside. But in this case, the size of the family didn't work against their invisibility. It may have worked for it. A household this isolated, moving this often, simply never gave any of those potential witnesses the chance to exist in the first place. There was no teacher because there was no school, no pediatrician because there were no medical records, no curious neighbor's kid because no other child ever saw these children up close. Every point where visibility might normally happen had already been removed before it could ever occur. And this is where the story stops being just a tragedy and starts being an active legal fight, one that's unfolding right now while you're watching this. After the arrests, one of the defense attorneys filed a motion arguing that public statements from officials, comments comparing conditions in that house to how livestock are kept, language calling the situation an act of pure evil, had already poisoned the potential jury pool in a county of only about 13,000 people. His argument was that in a county that small, everyone has already heard those comments, and a fair trial might not be possible unless officials stop talking publicly about the case altogether. He didn't just file the motion. He submitted a fully drafted order for the judge to sign, and the judge signed it the same day, without a hearing, without the prosecution being consulted or given a chance to respond. According to legal observers who reviewed the paperwork, the signed order still had the header "Proposed Order" on it, meaning it went from draft to enforceable law with essentially no independent review in between. Here's why that matters more than it might sound like at first. Legal experts who reviewed the actual wording of the order say it's written so broadly that, taken literally, it doesn't just apply to the prosecutor or the sheriff in this specific case. As written, it could technically bar any public official anywhere in the country from commenting on this case at all: a state governor in a completely unrelated state, a federal health official, potentially even other judges. One former deputy attorney general, who occasionally acts as a judge himself, pointed out that under the literal text of the order, even he could technically be at risk of contempt for discussing the case publicly. Most legal observers don't think that outcome was intentional. The read from several of them is that the defense attorney likely doesn't have extensive experience drafting gag orders, wrote language that felt natural without realizing how sweeping it was, and the judge signed a document that was handed to her without editing it first. But intent doesn't change what a signed court order legally says, and there's a deeper procedural problem underneath all of that. Under Ohio law, a judge generally can only issue an order this restrictive without a hearing if both sides, prosecution and defense, agree it's necessary. That did not happen here. The prosecution wasn't just left out of the conversation. According to reporting, they weren't even asked. One legal expert laid out exactly what should have happened instead. The judge should be required to hold an actual hearing, allow both sides to present real evidence, not assumptions, not gut feelings but evidence, about whether a fair trial is genuinely at risk without restricting public commentary. And only then, if that evidence actually supports it, issue a properly narrowed order. That's the legal standard. It's not what happened. He also pushed back on the underlying justification. Nearly everyone in that county already knows about this case. That part isn't in dispute. But he pointed out that widespread awareness alone isn't the legal bar for jury fairness. The real question is whether people who have heard about a case can still set that aside and judge it fairly. And that's something courts are specifically designed to test during jury selection itself, not something you prevent by cutting off public information beforehand. A major state newspaper has now formally challenged the order at the Ohio Supreme Court, arguing the judge never established the kind of evidence the law requires before restricting public officials this severely, and that less extreme options were never even considered. Meanwhile, a second defendant's legal team has now filed for a similar order of their own, this one aimed even more specifically at blocking officials from discussing evidence, witness credibility, or the character of anyone involved in the case. As of the most recent reporting, Ohio's highest court hadn't yet ruled. And into that vacuum of official silence, something else has already started filling the gap: images. Photos and videos claiming to show the inside of that house have begun circulating online. The prosecutor has publicly acknowledged that some of them might be real, and that some might be entirely AI-generated fakes. He said criminal charges are possible for anyone who physically entered that property without authorization, because it remains relevant to an active investigation. An unauthorized entry could compromise evidence. Think about what that actually means. Whether those images are real or fabricated, they're already out there. They've already been seen, which means any future jury pool in that county has, at minimum, been exposed to unverified imagery about a case that a judge has now tried, however messily, to keep out of the public conversation entirely. So here's where this case sits right now. a court order that legal experts say may not survive its own Supreme Court challenge. A prosecution that was cut out of a decision that directly affects its own case, and a public information vacuum that unverified, possibly fake content is already rushing in to fill. Whatever happens next in this legal fight is going to shape how much you and I are even allowed to know going forward. Now I want to zoom out, because there's a version of this story that isn't about one family at all. It's about an entire system, and the people whose job it was to catch exactly this kind of case. At a state hearing following the arrests, one lawmaker put it about as bluntly as anyone in an official capacity has. She compared Ohio's child protection system to a house that's slowly been allowed to crumble. She pointed out that in the most recent state budget cycle, lawmakers didn't fully fund child protective services at the level the state's own child welfare department had actually requested. She noted that the governor's own administration had already acknowledged the system was underfunded, and that county officials, regardless of political party, had been raising the alarm that their local systems were overwhelmed, long before this case ever made headlines. She said something that's likely to end up as one of the defining lines of this entire case, politically speaking, that nobody should be able to look at a case like this, 16 children, invisible for years, and claim the current system is working the way it needs to. She said the responsibility for that isn't isolated to one office or one county. It's shared. Interestingly, the state official overseeing this response pushed back gently against the idea that any single agency or individual failed here. His argument was more unsettling than an accusation would have been. He said nobody dropped the ball, because the family never generated a single interaction that would have put a ball in anyone's hands to begin with. No complaints filed in that county, no benefit applications, no school enrollment. In every administrative sense that matters, this family was invisible, not overlooked, invisible. But he didn't stop there. He acknowledged the system genuinely needs to improve better communication between counties when red flags like truancy get raised, better use of technology to spot patterns across jurisdictions, and a broader cultural shift toward encouraging ordinary people, neighbors, employers, distant relatives, to say something the moment something feels off, rather than assuming someone else will notice first. The lawmaker representing this district has said he intends to work directly with state officials to figure out exactly what changes could come out of this case, starting with what he called the most obvious fix available, making sure that when one county flags a family for something like truancy, that flag doesn't just disappear the moment the family crosses a county line. A state senator involved in the budget process has said he'd rather see the state overinvest in child protective services going forward than risk underfunding it again. Whether any of that translates into actual, lasting policy change, or whether this becomes another case that generates outrage for a few weeks and then fades from the legislative agenda the way similar cases have before, is genuinely still an open question. That's not cynicism. That's just the track record of cases like this one, in state after state, for decades. And if that pattern sounds familiar, it's because cases like this aren't actually unprecedented in the broader sense. A family disappearing from public view while raising a large number of children in conditions the outside world never sees. What tends to separate the cases that actually change policy from the ones that don't isn't the severity of what was found. It's whether the public pressure holds long enough for lawmakers to still be talking about it 6 months later, once the news cycle has moved on to something else. That's arguably the single biggest variable left in this entire story. Not what happens in the courtroom, but whether anyone is still paying attention by the time a new state budget gets written. Let's get concrete for a moment, because it's easy to lose the actual legal thread in a case this large. 3 of the 4 adults involved remain in custody, held on bonds in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that none of them have been able to post. All 3 have pleaded not guilty to multiple counts of child endangering. The 4th, the older grandfather, is currently out of custody, receiving treatment at a hospital for a serious, undisclosed medical condition, with a formal competency evaluation underway to determine whether he's even capable of understanding the proceedings against him. He has also pleaded not guilty. The next major step is a grand jury presentation. But the county involved here is so small that it only convenes a grand jury roughly once every other month, which creates real friction with speedy trial rules that don't bend just because a county is small. One legal expert following the case flagged something worth understanding. Regardless of how infrequently that grand jury meets, the clock on defendants' speedy trial rights keeps running at the same pace it would in a county 20 times the size. Prosecutors don't have the luxury of an indefinite runway here, unless the defense itself agrees to waive those rights. There's also a slower-moving bottleneck that rarely gets attention in cases like this: digital evidence. If investigators are working through phones, tablets, or other devices recovered from the home, and there are indications some of the older children had access to phones and social media, that evidence has to go through crime labs that are already, by most accounts, significantly backlogged, particularly for digital forensics. That kind of processing can take weeks, sometimes months, before it's even usable in court. Investigators have said publicly that additional charges beyond the current counts remain possible as the investigation continues. As of now, this case is still active, and officials have continued asking anyone with relevant information to come forward. It's also worth understanding why a county this small is having to carry a case this large almost entirely on its own. Rural counties across the country often share the same structural limitation: a handful of prosecutors, a small court calendar, and a child services office that, on a normal week, might handle a fraction of what this single case demands. When a case of this scale lands in a jurisdiction built for a caseload a tenth its size, delays aren't a sign of anyone failing to do their job. They're often just the honest math of limited staff meeting an enormous, sudden demand. That's part of why the emergency state funding mattered as much as it did. Money alone doesn't speed up a courtroom calendar, but it does determine whether the county can even keep functioning while this case works its way through it. So legally, this case is still very much in motion. But underneath the legal timeline, there's a much harder question, the one nobody in this story, on any side of it, has actually been able to answer. What makes 4 adults look at a situation like this and agree, in some form, that it's okay? Was it isolation, stretched out over so many years that it started to feel normal from the inside? Was it the slow physical and mental decline of 2 people who had once genuinely held a household together, with nobody left close enough to notice the moment they stopped being able to? Was it something closer to control, a pattern handed down and never questioned, inside a household where at least one adult may have been shaped by conditions not unlike the ones her own children ended up living in? The people who actually knew this family don't agree with each other. And listening closely to some of their public statements, it's not even clear all of them fully believe their own explanation. Here's what we do know, without question. 16 children are now living in foster homes, spread across a region that was never built or funded to absorb them all at once. And every account from people who have handled cases like this before says the same thing. The hardest part isn't the removal. It's everything that comes after years of therapeutic care, relationship building, and trust rebuilding that no single court date, no verdict, no sentence is going to resolve on its own. Being pulled out of that house is not the same thing as being safe. For these 16 children, in the truest sense, that part of the story is only just beginning. Think about what recovery actually looks like for a child in this situation. It's not just physical healing, although for some of these children, that alone will take time. It's relearning things most of us never had to consciously learn at all: what a regular bedtime feels like, what it means to be spoken to gently, what it feels like to be looked at by an adult without fear underneath it. For the older children, it may mean learning to read for the first time at an age when their peers are thinking about college applications. For the youngest, It may mean the strange mercy of having almost no memory of the room they were found in at all. Caseworkers who have handled cases involving large numbers of siblings removed at once often say the same thing. The instinct is to focus entirely on safety and stability, and that instinct is correct, but it's not the whole picture. These children didn't just lose a household. In whatever twisted form it took, they lost the only version of family they'd ever known, including each other, if the system separates them across different foster placements instead of keeping siblings together wherever possible. That detail alone, whether these 16 children stay connected to one another through this process, may end up mattering more to their long-term recovery than almost anything that happens in a courtroom. Whatever verdicts come down in this case, whatever the Ohio Supreme Court decides about that gag order, whatever the grand jury ultimately charges, none of it will be the thing that determines whether these 16 children are actually okay 5 or 10 years from now. That outcome is going to be shaped quietly, slowly, by therapists and foster families and caseworkers whose names will never make a headline. That's worth remembering the next time a case like this fades out. If you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you sitting with a story this heavy for this long. That's not something I take for granted. This case is going to keep developing. There's a Supreme Court ruling on the gag order still pending. There's a grand jury presentation still coming. There's a competency evaluation that could change the entire shape of this prosecution. And there are 16 children whose story doesn't end when this video does. So here's my ask, one more time. If you haven't already, subscribe now, because when the next major update in this case breaks, I want you to be one of the first people to see it, not scrolling past it 3 days later. Like this video if it gave you something worth thinking about, because it genuinely helps this reach more people who need to see this story. And leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me honestly which explanation you find most convincing, because I read every single one, and I'll be featuring some of your responses in the follow-up. Until the next update, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. And if there's one thing worth carrying with you after watching this, let it be this. Attention is the one resource this case has never had enough of, and it's the one thing all of us watching right now can actually give it. Keep an eye on where this goes.